Hey guys, so today I'm here with the Teraflex 2.5-inch lift kit with the 9550 VSS shocks, fitting all 2007 to 2018 4-door Jeep Wranglers, and we also have an option for the 2-door available as well, so make sure you get the right one for your Jeep. So if you're looking for a moderate lift, but still looking for a comfortable ride, this Teraflex 2.5-inch lift kit is a perfect option to take a look at. Now this is going to be for the daily driver who wants to get a lift on their Wrangler, but they're looking for something that's not too crazy. They want something that's still comfortable, like I mentioned, but they're also looking for better performance on the trail with more up travel in their wheel well for better articulation on the trail. So as far as tires go, this is going to be able to fit up to a 35-inch tire. Now 33s will obviously be able to fit on this since they are smaller, and they are going to give you some more room in the wheel well for better up travel. And as far as 37s go, they're going to be a tight fit. Now you will be able to get them on here, but you're not going to have a lot of room in the wheel well. You will be hitting your inner fender liner, so I definitely think a 35-inch tire is your best bet. Now as far as price goes, this is going to be roughly $750, and I personally think that that's a really good price point and it fits this kit very well. Now there are going to be other less expensive options for 2.5-inch lift kits on the page, but not all of them are going to be an all-inclusive kit like this. So for example, other options will come with coil spacers instead of coils with the shocks, or some other options will come with the coils but only come with shock adapters and not the shocks. So it really comes down to if you're looking for an all-inclusive kit. So on the other hand, there are going to be more expensive kits that range anywhere from $1,000 all the way up to $3,000. Most of those are going to be for very tuning specific suspension, as well as coilover systems that come with subframes and all of the bells and whistles. Now obviously you don't need all the bells and whistles. You can use a standard kit like this and it's going to get the job done, and it's going to give you a very nice ride height. Plus, Teraflex is a very trustworthy brand and they make quality components, and I definitely think that they did a great job with this 2.5-inch lift kit. Install is going to be a 2 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. Lift kits aren't easy, but I'm going to walk you through it. So speaking of the install, let's jump into that now. So the tools that I used for my install were an assortment of impact wrenches, 2 pry bars, a large pry bar and a small pry bar, a flathead screwdriver, an assortment of extensions, an assortment of wrenches. You will need a ratchet as well as a provided tool, a trim removal tool, an assortment of sockets as well as swivel sockets, and an assortment of hammers. So first things first, we're going to put our Jeep up in the air. Now if you don't have a lift and you're using a jack and jack stands, we're going to start in the rear. So jack up the rear of your JK and then you can chock the front wheels. So now I'm going to go ahead and take off these wheels and tires. Now these do have a 6-spline lug nut on them, so I'm using a key as well as a 19mm socket. So they're all off. We can pop this tire off. So our next step is to support our axle. So I grabbed 2 pole jacks and I'm just going to set those underneath here since we are lowering our axle down to get our new springs in. So I grabbed an 18mm socket as well as an 18mm wrench, and I did grab an extension because we are going to go behind the shock body here. Now we can remove the top part with a 18mm wrench and an 18mm deep socket. Now we're going to save our stock sway bar end links because we will be moving these to the front. So next we're gonna remove the shock. So first we're gonna start with the bottom bolt with an 18mm deep socket and an 18mm wrench. Now we're going to use a 16mm swivel socket and extension to remove the 2 top shock bolts. Now we can start to lower our axle down to get our spring out. Now keep an eye on your ABS lines as well as your emergency brake lines and your standard brake lines. We want to make sure that we're not maxing those out and we're not damaging them, as well as your breather hose on your axle. Now this will just pop off, but let's go ahead and lower this axle down. You want to do it evenly between both sides. Your breathers getting maxed out here. We can just pop that off. You can extend this too. You can add a breather extension and some tubing. We may have to remove the emergency brake line bolts in a little bit. That's okay. So it looks like on this side, our brake line is maxed. I'm gonna grab a trim removal tool and pop that clip out. So this right here is our ABS sensor and it's looking a little maxed out on this side. So I'm gonna grab a trim removal tool and pop that out. That's just gonna give us a little bit more slack to work with there. So what I'm gonna do next is remove the 2 10mm nuts that are holding our emergency brake line cables. These can get pretty rusty, but if you take a lower impact to them or a hand ratchet, they should be just fine. I'm using a 10mm deep socket to do this. So once that bracket kind of slips down, that'll give us some more room to work with. I'm also going to use this 10mm socket to remove the brake line brackets, just so we have room to work with there as well. So again, I'm going to take that 10mm socket and just loosen up this brake line bracket right here. I'm just going to unclip this just to give ourselves more room to work with. I don't want anything to kink or break, especially a brake line, so I'm going to disconnect all of these while dropping our axle. So once we've lowered down our axle enough, you should be able to get these springs out. So what we're gonna do next is install our rear brake line drop bracket. This is gonna make sure that this is not maxed out. So we are gonna take the top portion and thread that into the OEM location. We'll take our 10mm socket and tighten that down. Once that's on there, we can grab our provided hardware by Teraflex and 2 flat washers and secure that down. Now we can go ahead and tighten that down with a 12mm socket and a 12mm wrench. Then we can do the same thing on the other side. So now we're gonna attach our bump stop extension to our axle. There is a welded plate on there already. We're gonna take the provided hardware, the bolt with the flat washer, and bolt that through. There's gonna be 2 holes on either side of your bump stop. Now we're gonna leave that loose for just a second and attach our other side. Now I'm going to take two 13mm wrenches and tighten that down. So after we're finished the other side of the bump stop, we can move to the other side. So what we're gonna do next is remove our bottom track bar bolt. This is gonna allow us to drop the axle a little bit more to squeeze our springs in, and we do have to get a bracket on the axle side of this in just a little bit. So I'm gonna take a 21mm socket and remove this bolt. As you can see, the axle shifted because this is what keeps our axles centered. I'm just going to pry that out of there in just a second. So I'm going to take a small pry bar and just get that out of the way. Then we'll be able to lower our axle a little bit more. Now we're just going to test fit, see if our spring fits. So I do have our factory isolator on there. We're just going to slip the spring in. And it looks like we do have enough room to get that over the spring perch. Rest that there, get our other spring in, and pump off that axle. Right. Now we can move our axle up just to keep the springs in place. And we are going to install a retainer on the bottom axle side spring perch. So now I'm going to take our large washer. This is going to be our spring retainer. I'm also going to take the provided bolt with that, as well as the lock washer, and secure that through the spring perch. Then we're going to grab our provided tool and our nut, and we are going to go around to the other side of the axle. We're going to squeeze this between the axle and the perch and tighten this up. So with our provided tool holding the nut underneath the spring perch, we're going to take a 9/16 inch ratcheting wrench, or you could use a socket, and we're going to go ahead and tighten this down. Now we can do the same thing on the other side. Basically what this tool is just to be able to balance the nut while you can tighten it down underneath the spring perch. So once that's hand tight, we can take that 9/16 inch wrench and tighten that down. So what we're gonna do next is install our rear track bar relocation bracket, and we're gonna start by removing the bottom driver's side lower control arm bolt. So I'm gonna be using a 21mm socket as well as a 21mm wrench to get that out. I'm just using a little baby pry bar to get that out. So our next step is to line up our bracket. So as you can see, this bottom bracket or this bottom arm is going to be connected by our control arm bolt. We can go ahead and reinstall that now. So what I'm doing now is taking a pry bar just to line that control arm back up. We can get our bolt through. And then we can thread on the nut on the other side. Before we tighten that down, I'm just gonna make sure that everything lines up correctly. We'll be putting our track bar up here. So we can grab our hardware. So what we're gonna do now is reinstall our stock track bar bolt in the stock location. This is gonna hold our track bar in place, as well as this bottom bolt and our U-bolt that we'll put on in a second. So we're gonna take our flag nut, insert it on the other side. Now we're going to take our U-bolt with the provided hardware and attach this around our axle. We're going to take our flat washers and attach those. Now we're going to thread on our provided nuts. We can take a 19mm deep socket and go ahead and tighten those down. So now that our bracket's in place, we can tighten up our lower control arm bolt. We're going to be tightening that up with the 21mm socket and a 21mm wrench. So what I'm going to do first is install one of the bolts, since this is the same style as the factory with our pin here. We are going to do that, and then we'll be able to hook it on and install our other bolt. So what might make this easier is to grab your socket as well as your extension and use that to help guide the bolt in. So once that's in, I'm gonna go ahead and tighten those down with that 16mm swivel socket and the extension in my air ratchet. So what I'm going to do now is just raise up our axle to meet the bottom of our shock, since our axle is still lowered. Then we can take our shock bolt, put that through the bottom of our shock here. Tighten that down. We're going to grab our 18mm wrench and 18mm socket and tighten that down. Now we can secure the other side. Now we can install our new rear sway bar link. Starting up at the top, we're going to secure that down with our provided nut here. We're going to tighten that down in just a second after we get the bottom secured. Now I'm going to stick the bolt through first. It may be a little bit easier to do this before you put on the shock. However, you still can finagle it around. And we can reinstall our nut. Now on the bottom, we are reusing our factory hardware. Now we're going to tighten up this top nut with a 19mm deep socket. Now we can go back and tighten that down with an 18mm socket and an extension, as well as an 18mm open-ended wrench. So before we can move to the front, we just have to reconnect our emergency brake line, the mounting point. So we're just going to thread on those 10mm nuts that we took off originally. We can tighten those back down with our 10mm socket. Now we can head on up to the front. So now that we're in the front, I took our pull jacks and supported our axle, and we're going to start by removing the bottom bolt on our front sway bar links. Now, because this is on the passenger side with the track bar bracket and the steering stabilizer bracket, this bolt is kind of hard to get to. So I'm using an 18mm swivel as well as a wrench to get to that and take that off. So now we're going to go ahead and take our 18mm swivel. You can use a deep socket, you can use a regular socket, and a 19mm wrench to hold the sway bar still. Since this is a stud, we're going to go ahead and remove that. So now we can do the same thing on the other side. So what we're gonna do now is remove the bottom of our shock so we can lower our axle down. I'm gonna be using an 18mm wrench on the nut side and an 18mm socket with an extension to clear our control arm here. Now we may have to raise up the axle to get some pressure off of that bolt. So we can get that out of there, and that is free. Now we can go to the other side and do the same thing. So now we're gonna do the same thing on the other side. However, I can't fit my gun on this side because of the differential. So I turn the steering knuckle out so I can give myself a little bit more room. So again, you may have to raise up that axle just a little bit to slide that bolt out. Get some pressure off of that bolt since our axle did drop a little bit. Now we'll be able to lower our axle down. So we're gonna go back to our shocks in just a minute so we can take off that top shock mount. However, I'm gonna start lowering our axle, see how much room we can get. I also do want as much room as possible up at the top shock. So we most likely will have to take out our bottom track bar bolt just to drop our axle to the lowest so we can get our springs out. But we're gonna move over to the shocks as of right now. So what we're gonna do next is fully remove our shock. Now you're gonna need a 16mm ratcheting wrench and a 16 or 17mm open-ended wrench to hold the shock body still. Now on JKs, this is very common to break because the nuts do get very rusty on that shock post. But if it does break, it's not a problem because our new shocks come with all of the hardware, everything that you need to install them. So it doesn't matter if these get trashed, it's okay. So we're gonna go ahead and put our 17mm wrench on here, on our shock body. There is a nut there. Then we're gonna take our ratcheting wrench, go up top, make sure it's on loosen. We are going to loosen that up the best we can. So like I said, these shocks do have issues with coming off if they are very rusted. The nut rusts on top of the stud there, and they are very difficult to get off. Now, a lot of you may not have this issue, but we are having this issue. So what we did in order to solve for that was take a Sawzall. If you are taking a Sawzall, make sure you wear safety goggles as well as safety gloves. But we took a Sawzall and chopped the top off of the stud so we can fit a socket on it. We're gonna use a 16mm socket and a ratchet, and that's gonna give us a little bit more leverage, a little bit more room to work with than our ratcheting wrench did. So we're gonna go ahead and remove that now. Also, the wrench on the shock body should be a 16. Ours was very rusted and wouldn't go on, so I had to start off using a 17. So we did have to do the same thing on this side by cutting off the top of the stud in order to get the nut to move with a socket. But now I'm just going to loosen up that nut with a 16mm ratcheting wrench and a 16mm open-ended wrench to hold the shock body still. Oh, there it goes, and now we can fully remove our shock. So what we're gonna do next is remove the axle side bolt of the track bar. This is gonna be a 21mm bolt, so I'm gonna use a 21mm socket as well as an extension to clear our tie rod here. As you can see, the whole axle shifted, but this is gonna free up some room so we're able to drop our axle. So what we're gonna do next is remove our brake line bracket. This is gonna be a 10mm bolt. We're gonna use a 10mm socket and a ratchet or an impact wrench in order to remove that. And we don't have a drop bracket for the front. Now you can get a drop bracket for the front. You can get extended brake lines. You don't necessarily need them. However, we're just doing this so when we drop the axle, we're not maxing out our brake line. We have some room to work with. So we can do that for the other side as well. Then after that bracket is out, we can go ahead and drop our axle. So we need to drop it low enough to get our spring out, and we need to drop it low enough to get our bump stop extension as well as our new bump stop in. So we will need to drop our axle pretty low. Now you will have a breather on your differential. We can disconnect that, just like the one on the back. It's just gonna be a hose that you can pop off. Make sure to watch all of your other lines. Now it looks like we have enough room where we can easily pop our spring out. So what we're gonna do now is install our bump stops and bump stop extension. So our Jeep doesn't currently have bump stops, but all you have to do is twist the bump stop out. Then we can install our bump stop and our bump stop extension. You can grease this, but they are pretty easy to put in the extension. Now what we're gonna do is take some grease and grease the outside of this because we are going to put it on our Jeep in just a second. And we want this to be easiest process as possible. So what we're gonna do now, I've lifted the axle and got some blocks of wood. So we're going to place that and line that up. And what we're gonna do at this point is raise our axle. Now this is gonna push our bump stop extension very evenly inside of our bump stop perch there. You may have to hold it, but this is going to be the easiest way to get this done. You may have to raise up the other side of the axle to even that out. This is how Teraflex recommends to do it. And if you've ever tried to put these in by yourself without this process, you know that it is a very difficult process. Ah, there we go, buddy. And your bump stop, once you see that it slides in the slot, is in. We can lower back down our axle. That is in place, and we can move to the other side. We're gonna place our bump stop in there as straight as we can. Start to raise our axle. After you see that it's seated, we can lower our axle back down. So now we're ready to go ahead and install our springs, but before we did that, I wanted to show you guys a side-by-side of your stock spring compared to your new spring. So this is obviously gonna be taller. That's what's gonna be giving you your 2.5 inches of lift. It's also gonna look a lot better. Springs can rust over time. As you can see on the bottom of this, it is getting pretty worn and rusty. So we definitely want to swap that out with a new component. So now that we have our axle dropped all the way down, we can go ahead and do that. So what we can do now is get our spring installed. Make sure to have your axle all the way lowered so we can finagle that in there. Now it is gonna sit a little bit weird. That's just because our axle is pushed back as well as pushed sideways. So once we get this seated properly, this bump stop is not actually gonna hit your coil like that. So let's move over to the other side and then we can raise up our axle. You also want to make sure that the bottom of the spring seats properly in the spring retainer on the spring perch. So now we can go ahead and raise up our axle so we can get our spring seated properly. And the reason why our axle gets pushed back when we lower our axle is because our control arms are pulling it back. So as you can tell, once the axle is moved forward, this will not look as funky and won't be touching your spring anymore. Now there's a big difference between hydraulic shocks as well as nitrogen charged shocks. So your hydraulic shock, like your factory shock, is going to be more fluid-like, it's going to be a little bit more comfortable. However, it's very susceptible to shock fade over time, which is cavitation or foaming forming inside of the shock when it's worked really hard, like hard trails or bumps at fast speeds. So it's always a good idea, if you are working your shocks very hard, to go to a nitrogen charged shock like the Teraflex 9550. Now this shock that's included in this lift kit is going to last a very long time because that nitrogen really stops that cavitation from happening. It keeps the oil and the gas separate with an internal floating piston. It's going to be very durable and it's going to last a very long time. So this is not gonna be as comfortable as a hydraulic shock, but it is gonna have that durability out of it, and it still is gonna give you a comfortable ride, just not very fluid like the hydraulic shock with all of that oil in it. Now let's go ahead and install these new ones on our Wrangler. So you are gonna have provided hardware. You're gonna have a washer as well as the bushing. That's gonna go in the shock stud first. You're also gonna have another bushing and another washer that we're gonna put on top of the shock tower. So let's go ahead and install this first. Then you're gonna have a nut that you'll be able to thread onto the top there to hold that in place. So what we're gonna do now is take a 15mm ratcheting wrench and tighten that down. Now we can secure the bottom of our shock with our stock bolt. Now you may have to adjust your axle height in order to get this lined up. Looks like we are pretty lined up here. We're gonna shimmy that through, put the nut on the other side, and then we can go ahead and tighten that down. So just how we took it off, I'm gonna use that 18mm socket and extension and the 18mm wrench to tighten that down. Now we can do the other side. So now we can take our rear sway bar end links, since they are gonna be a lot longer than our stock front sway bar end links, and we can install them on our front sway bar. So we're gonna start with the top. We're gonna thread on that nut on the other side of the link. And while we're free on both sides, I'm gonna do that on the other side as well. So we're just gonna quickly do the other side while our sway bar is free. Then we're gonna take our 19mm wrench to hold the stud still and our 18mm socket to tighten that down. So after those are on there, we can line it up with the bottom and stick our bolt through. So I'm gonna take an 18mm wrench and an 18mm swivel socket and tighten that down. So quickly before we go ahead and reattach our track bars, what we want to do is reconnect our brake lines first. So we can take those bolts that we took out, thread those back in, tighten those up with a 10mm socket. Do the same thing on the other side. So now that we have our track bar relocation bracket on our axle, what we're gonna do is take our provided sleeve and put that where our stock bolt was located. Now you may have to open up this hole a little bit. So what we're gonna do now, I'm just taking a small hammer and just tapping that in place. Just so we have everything lined up. Now we're gonna take our new provided bolt with our flat washer and we are going to put that through. So once we have that bolt through, I'm going to take a flat washer and a nut that was provided to us, and I'm gonna thread that in on the other side. So we can take a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket. We can go ahead and tighten that up. So now we can move on to installing our U-bolt. So we can put that through, put our washers, flat washers on, then we can thread on the provided hardware. Now we can take a 19mm deep socket and tighten that down. So we saved our track bars for last, but what we did here was took a ratchet strap just to move the axle over just a little bit. You can either do that, just make sure that you are staying safe with that, or you could put the Jeep down on its own weight and reattach the track bar that way. Now we're gonna do that for the front, but for the rear we used a ratchet strap. So now we're gonna take our stock bolt and pass that through our bracket as well as our track bar. So you can give it a little bit of a tap just to get it through there. Then you can take your flag nut and attach that on the back. So to thread that on the flag nut on the back, we're gonna take a ratchet and a 21mm socket and just tighten that down. And once it's threaded on, we can move on to tightening that down with an air impact or a standard impact. All right, and then we're all set to go. So now we can go ahead and reinstall our wheels and tires. So now that the Jeep's back on its own weight, we can reinstall our track bar bolt for the front. Now, if it does not line up, ours is lining up pretty well. So if it doesn't line up, you can have a friend get in the driver's seat and steer the Jeep back and forth, and that will align the hole that way. But ours seems to be lining up pretty well. So we're gonna get our bolt through. Then we can take our flag nut and do the same thing that we did with the back. Thread that on. Then we can tighten that down with our 21mm socket, and I'm using an extension well to clear our drag link as well as our tie rod. After that's tightened down, you're all set to go. So that's gonna wrap it up for my review and install on the Teraflex 2.5-inch lift kit with the 9550 VSS shocks, fitting all 2007 to 2018 four-door JK Wranglers. For more videos like this, keep it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.